Okay, I'm making this video primarily for my kids, and I'll tell you a little story about why, but I thought I would share it with everyone. When my kids were growing up, when our kids were growing up, we memorized what I consider to be the best chapter in the Bible to read and to memorize, and that is, of course, Romans 12. It is an amazing chapter. I highly suggest you read it. Strongly suggest you read it and memorize it and practice it and study it. The strings that come from it are absolutely endless and amazing. Lots of other good verses, chapters, books in the Bible. My favorite book is the book of James, but Romans 12 fully encapsulates our lives in Christ and so many different aspects of God's nature, and it's just a great chapter. But I missed something. I don't know how I missed this, but I don't know if you're like me, but oftentimes I read the Bible and I've read it many times. For example, I've probably read the book of Luke, I don't know how many times, but dozens and dozens of times. And I still read it, and sometimes I read something and I'm like, well, where was that last time I read it? And God shows me something new. The first verse in Romans 12, it says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. I missed the word therefore. It's not that I'd never read Romans chapter 11 before, but I just didn't, for some reason, this came out to me just this morning, and so I thought I would expand on it a little bit, primarily because it points directly at Israel, and there's a lot of questions, especially for young people. My kids are in their 20s, and for everyone, about Israel and what is Israel and who is Israel and what does the Bible mean when it says Israel. I'm not a Bible scholar, I'm not a theologian, I'm an engineer, a dad, and somebody who loves Jesus. Happy Easter. It is Easter evening today. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of this. I'm not going to read all of chapter 11, but whenever you see a word like therefore, the word therefore, it always should prompt you, and I learned this, oh my gosh, decades ago. That's why I'm shocked that I didn't think about it, because we literally memorized this whole chapter. You always look ahead you always look, previous. You look at the previous chapter or previous verses to see, okay, well, what are they talking about? I appeal to you, therefore. Okay, well, that is connecting to something that was said previous. And so if you read Romans 11, it talks abundantly about Israel. And it opens with Paul is sort of asking about the Israel and the remnant and the promise. He even goes all the way back to Elijah and Elijah's question to God, or his pleading almost to God of like, hey, I seem like I'm the last person left here. What's going on? And God gives this indication that he says this, he says, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed their knee to Baal. So God kept a remnant. And what's interesting about this, again, the book of Romans is in the New Testament. And so there's two reasons why this is quite interesting. Number one, because it's in the New Testament, so it's post grace, or post the gift of grace through Jesus, through really what today is all about, the resurrection of Christ. The other thing is that it's God's it's God's doing. He says that I have kept for myself a remnant of 7,000 men. So it's something that God did. It wasn't something like, oh, these 7,000 men were so good and they followed all the laws or whatever. They did it themselves. No, it was an act of grace. Let's see. So let's move on here a little bit. This whole chapter is kind of talking about Israel in many different ways. The next, if you go down to, I think it's verse 8, it says, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And I didn't look up the reference for where that came from. And I don't see it here real quick. I guess it doesn't matter. But so God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear, down to this very day. So you think about, number one, this chapter in this book is written by Paul. Previously Saul, who as Saul on the road to Damascus, he lost his sight when the Spirit of God, Jesus, angel, came and spoke to him and basically at that moment transformed his life. But that reminds me of, because it says in there, it says, a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear. So it's like a spiritual blinding, right? If you go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, if you read this whole first 12 verses, it's quite interesting. It's talking about the man of lawlessness. But read what it says, listen to what it says in 11 and 12. So this is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. It says, therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned, who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So it's like God's purposely blinding them. Because of their truth, it says, because they didn't believe the truth and they had pleasure in unrighteousness. What is righteousness? Righteousness is right standing with God. So because they rejected God and they did not believe the truth, he sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that they may be condemned. Now, I'll just take a little sidebar here. If you read Luke 9 and 10, and I'm a continuist, I can't believe this whole crazy talk about cessationists and all this stuff that's going around lately. I don't believe in that. I'm a continuist. I believe that God still operates through us today. In Luke 9 and 10, he gave us the power. He gave disciples, not just his 12 disciples, but the 72 that he sent out before him, the power to do two things, which, by the way, both of these are completely unacceptable in most churches in America, which is really sad. People want to ask what's wrong with the church in America. Let me tell you. God gave them the ability to do two things. Number one, he gave them the ability to heal the sick. And number two, he gave them the ability to cast out demons, or to deal with evil spirits, or the spiritual realm, evil within the spiritual realm. In John, if you go to John 9, Jesus healed the blind man, and you see that in my faith, in my history as a Christian, I've always thought about physical healing when he was talking about healing the sick. And I've always thought about whenever I read John 9 or any other instances where the sight was healed, I always thought it was physical issue. And I think in John 9 it was, because the disciples even asked Jesus in there, they said, well, Jesus, why was this man blind? Was it his sin or was it his parents' sin? And Jesus was like, no, it wasn't any of that. It was so that my glory could be known. And so that was a physical healing, but it could have been a spiritual healing too. And my point is that God's given us the ability to heal this blindness. Well, how do we do that? We do it through prayer. Prayer is our most powerful weapon here on earth, and operating in the spiritual realm. We have the ability, Book of James says the prayer of a righteous man is powerful and effective. We can lay hands on our brothers and sisters. You can anoint them with oil. You can pray fervently. You can pray diligently. You can pray for people to be healed. And I believe that we have the power to do that. Now, it's not magic. It doesn't magically happen just because you pray, but that's what God has given us the ability to do. Same with dealing with evil and just demonic forces and things and crazy stuff that we're seeing at work clearly today, where I just had a circumstance just this weekend where clearly a person that I think is generally a good person, as far as I can tell, a little bit crazy, very active and vocal, but was clearly directed to do evil. We have the ability to pray for that and to cleanse ourselves of that and to cleanse each other of that. But the point there is that he's talking about the same thing, where God has given them a form of blindness that is maybe not physical, but it means they can't for some reason see the truth, and so they just continue in their unrighteousness. which is basically separation from God. This all ties together with what happens next here. It says that, so I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Now he's speaking of the Jewish people here. Rather, their trespass salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. So, in other words, the Jews or the Israelites were prevented from being able to basically accept Jesus and believe in Jesus and to see him as the fulfillment of all the prophecies that they had been waiting their entire lives for, to see the Savior. Because of why? Because God intended this to be a worldwide movement to affect the entire world, and so he basically made it so the Jews couldn't see him for the most part. And the truth is, and it says right here, it says jealous Jews, and it draws the Jews to himself because of their jealousy. But it also, in the converse, is true. The fact that the Jews didn't accept Jesus also allowed Christianity to become a worldwide movement, where it wouldn't have been otherwise. It would have been limited to, some sect within Israel. It wouldn't have gone throughout the world. So this is all part of God's plan, and it's amazing the provision that he has for Israel here. You got to see this. So continuing on here now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, that's us, how much more will their full inclusion mean? So again, this leans into this provision that God has as what seems to be a bit of a separate path for the Israelites or for the Jewish people. Let's see, let's jump down. Excuse me. Jump down to verse 19. It says, then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. In other words, Jewish people or Israelites were taken out so that there might be room for the Gentiles. That's the way I see that. And it says that is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. Again, their unbelief was prompted because God needed them to not believe so that the Gentiles could be grafted in. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. He goes on to say, for if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. So, in other words, it's incumbent on us to sort of, I guess you'd call it, maintain our faith or continue to trust in God, even when things are difficult. I think of, Erica Kirk right now losing her beloved Charlie Kirk, amazing man. She's not going to walk away from God. That's kind of an example of what they're talking about when you face difficult times. This also sort of harkens back to, I think most people, when we're talking about the branches and the vines, you'll think of John 15:5, which says it even more clear. It says that in John 15:5, it says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. Excuse me. Oh, sorry. So that's the one where I think most people, when they think of the vine and the branches, they think of John 15:5, because it's more clear. Again, I am the vine, you are the branch. Whoever abides in me and I in him, it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. He's speaking to Christians. It could be Gentile or Jew, it doesn't matter. If they're Christians, then we have to realize that we are a branch on a tree that is rooted in Jesus. It is rooted in God, and we can only do what he enables us and what he calls us and what he allows us to do. We can bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Doesn't mean you're going to stop breathing. It just means you're not going to do anything of value for the kingdom. Okay, jump down to 23. It says, and even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. he's talking about the Jews here. He's saying, okay, even if they do not continue in their unbelief, he's talking about the Jews. If, for example, we pray for somebody who is an unbeliever, maybe they're a Jew, then they believe, they stop their unbelief. That's what he's saying. It's a double negative. Then they can be grafted in. So they were ungrafted or cut off from the tree or the root, but they can be grafted in again. That's what he's saying. And it says, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you are cut off from what it is by nature, a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? So what he's saying there is, as a Gentile, we were grafted into a tree in unnatural means. So we are not, say, for example, as a Gentile, we're not an olive branch, right? We're maybe a branch from a maple tree, or I don't know, oak tree or something, whatever. That branch was grafted into the olive tree in an unnatural way. It doesn't diminish or reduce our access or our connection or our ability to be an heir to the throne with Jesus as a brother because of his work today, resurrection Sunday. It's the reason why we go to church on Sundays, is because we're celebrating the resurrection every single week. If we can be grafted into an olive tree that's unnatural, he's saying, how much more can a branch that was grown on that tree be regrafted in, because it is by very nature part of that tree. So it's very interesting. It goes on to say that it continues with Israel's salvation, and this is where it gets very interesting, because again it says that they were given a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles have come in. So it's like a waiting period. It's like God's waiting for the Gentiles to all, turn their hearts to him. It's pretty amazing. And then it goes on to say, as regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. In other words, the Jews' hearts were turned by God so that the Gentiles would have access and that we could be grafted in. But it goes on to say that, but in regards to election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. This is where it gets very interesting to me theologically, and I'm definitely over my heads here, but what I'm reading in this is that it says, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now you have received mercy because of your disobedience, so too they have now been disobedient, in order that they may, by the mercy shown to you, they may also now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Basically, what I'm reading this to say is that the Gentile, or the Jews who were chosen, are chosen regardless. They're grafted in regardless, and it's very interesting because it kind of negates a lot of the other back and forth that we were talking about in regards to the Jews, because he says right there, it says, as regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. He's talking to the Gentiles. But then he says, but as regards to election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. So election is basically, who did God create on the potter's wheel? Who did he create, and who did he choose to be with him for eternity? That is what it's saying when it's talking about election. And it says right there that the Jews they're good. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. So they're grafted in. I think that's pretty astounding, and it's very timely. It's very timely today because there are so many people who are asking about Israel and what is the biblical Israel. And there is a lot of confusion around that, because I think it's primarily because, well, number one, I think people don't read their Bibles a lot. Number two, I think that we as a church in America have fallen prey to our spiritual feeding being on Sundays when that's not what God intended. God has given us these amazing lives, and he calls us to be Christians 7 days a week and to come together on Sundays for worship and for rest and for fellowship. Our church in America has been turned into, in a lot of cases, not in all, it's been turned into entertainment, and it's been turned into your time of spiritual feeding when that was not what God intended. God intended to feed you directly. Post Resurrection Sunday, he wanted to feed you directly. I guess you could say that could be post Good Friday, because that was when the curtain was torn from top to bottom, giving us access. I say this because I think that most people don't know what anti-Semitism is. I did another video on this, and I think that most people don't know what Zionism is. And I'll tell you, I know that to be the case because I continue to hear people define Zionism differently and even anti-Semitism differently, and it's quite interesting. I will also say that, and this is a little bit off topic, but just in terms of the American church, lest you think I think it's totally lost. I don't. But this is a test that you could do if you wanted to find out if you have the guts to do this, especially if you're a leader in a church. Figure out a way to quiz every member that's sitting in your church on Sunday to find out if they know what the gospel is. I would start a service like that. Hand out a piece of paper with a question on it that says, it just gives them 2 or 3 lines, very simple. Write down what the gospel means to you. What is the gospel? And I'm telling you that if the majority of your church cannot articulate that, if the majority of the American church cannot articulate that, then that is a huge problem for us here in America. And it is the reason why we have all this confusion around continuist versus cessationist. Because the feckless, weak American church generally doesn't know the gospel, so they don't have a connection to the greatest hope and joy that we have. In fact, if you want to be truthful, it's the only hope and joy that we have. Not to be totally negative Nilly on that, but if you go back to Genesis 15, and this goes back to the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 15. If you go to chapter 15, verses 18, it says, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." So, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates. You can look it up on a map if you want to. This is basically where I get my understanding of Zionism. So Zionism, this is quite interesting because there are different versions of this that I have never heard articulated until recently. So my understanding prior to hearing some of these other things of Zionism was, if you believe that Jews have a right to a place, then you are a Zionist. It's like, okay, I think Israel has a place, right? They have a land, they deserve to have a land, whatever. That's kind of my articulation of that. I recently heard on a podcast, a very, very popular person describe it as, if you believe that whatever 1949 or 1948 or something, return to the promised land, to Israel, was fulfillment of biblical prophecy, which is what I just read to you in Genesis 15:18. "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates." If you believe that what happened in 1940s for Israel was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, then you're a Zionist. I've never heard it described like that before. I just haven't. I always thought, my understanding of it is that if you believe that Israel has the right to have a place, a physical property, a land, a country, then you're a Zionist. And so you can take that for what it means, but it is quite interesting when you look at the map and see what the space is between the river of Egypt and the great river of Euphrates, and how big of a space that is. So my point with all that is that I'm not trying to magically answer the question, especially for the young people, of what is Israel. Israel could be a people, it could be a land, it could be God's people, it could be God's chosen, original, promised through the Abrahamic covenant. What does it mean? And I think this is valid when people ask questions about what does it mean to support Israel. We want to support Israel biblically, and so what exactly does that mean? What does that put on our shoulders? How should we best do that? And how are we to understand what Israel actually is? But I think that reading Romans 11, tying in, looking at the Abrahamic covenant described in Genesis 15, and really it goes in through 16, 17, and 18 in Genesis 15, 16, 17, and 18 chapters, very interesting in terms of God's promise to Israel. I think all of that is something that we ought to study. We ought to spend a little time. Get off your phones and Facebook, and where I'm going to post this probably, and read some of this stuff and try to figure it out for yourself. So really this is an extension of information that I wanted to share with my kids. They're all grown now, and just in regards to us studying and learning Romans 12, and hopefully it's helpful. And I know I don't answer all the questions about Israel, but the main thing I want to say is that there's a reason why Romans 12 is such a great chapter and why it follows Romans chapter 11. And Romans chapter 11 is all about God's relationship with Israel. And Rex is making some noise. He's fine. Rex, you want to do a cameo? Huh? You want to come say hi? So funny. Oh no, I don't want that slimy thing. So this is very, very important for us to understand, and it's very important for us to love Jesus and to have a relationship with him, and not get too caught up in this and too stressed about it, but also to know that the Bible is clear that the Jews, the Israelites, however we want to define that, however we land on defining that, is what they are God's original chosen. And out of them came people like Paul, who wrote this book. Jesus, if you read Luke 3, it gives you the genealogy of Jesus to prove that he came through the Israelites. It gives his entire genealogy. It's really quite interesting. So anyway, I feel like that's important, and I hope it's helpful, and I'm sorry I just spent 28 minutes describing it. I probably could have done it in 5 minutes if I was actually a pastor or something like that. So anyway, God bless you. Love you all. And if you haven't, give your heart to Jesus.